Imagine you're hiking through a remote jungle, somewhere far from civilization. You push through thick vines and suddenly you're standing in front of something impossible. Massive stone blocks, perfectly fitted together, weighing hundreds of tons each, intricate carvings covering every surface, advanced engineering that would challenge modern construction crews. And here's the part that makes your skin crawl. Carbon dating puts it at 50,000 years old, maybe older. That's tens of thousands of years before humans were supposed to have the knowledge, the tools, or the organization to build something like this. You stand there in the silence of the forest, and a question creeps into your mind like cold water. What if everything we've been taught about human history is wrong? Today we're going to explore an idea that sits at the edge of accepted archaeology, whispered about in academic corners, debated in late-night conversations, and buried in texts that mainstream history prefers to ignore. What if we are not the first advanced civilization on Earth? What if we're not even the second or the third? What if we are the seventh? 7 times humanity rose from primitive origins to build something remarkable. 7 times something wiped it all away. And 7 times the survivors crawled from the rubble and started again, carrying fragments of lost knowledge like precious seeds through the darkness. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect! That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I love reading them. Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, somewhere in between, all falling asleep to the same mysteries. The idea of cyclical civilizations isn't new. Ancient cultures around the world spoke of ages that came before, golden eras that fell into shadow, great floods and fires that reset everything. The Greeks talked about it. The Hindus built entire cosmologies around it. The Maya tracked it in their calendars with mathematical precision that still makes astronomers uncomfortable. But we modern people, we learn to dismiss these stories as mythology, primitive attempts to explain a chaotic world, nothing more than campfire tales. Except, what if they weren't just stories? What if they were memories? See, there's a growing collection of evidence that doesn't fit the neat timeline we're taught in school. Artifacts found in coal seams millions of years old, precision-cut stones in places where humans supposedly didn't exist, astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments built by people who weren't supposed to understand celestial mechanics, maps showing coastlines as they appeared before the last ice age, drawn with accuracy that required aerial surveying. Every time archaeologists find something that contradicts the established timeline, there's a scramble to explain it away. Coincidence, natural formation, misidentification. Sometimes those explanations work, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, when the evidence is too solid to dismiss, it often gets quietly filed away, forgotten, because it doesn't fit the story we've agreed to tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. Tonight, we're going to dig into those forgotten places. We're going to explore 6 civilizations that supposedly came before us. Lemuria, the mysterious land of the Pacific. Atlantis, the empire that defied the gods. Hyperborea, the paradise beyond the north wind. Mu, the motherland of the Pacific. The Antediluvian world before the Great Flood. And the builders, whoever they were, who left megalithic mysteries scattered across every continent. We're going to look at what might have destroyed them. Cataclysms on a scale that's hard to imagine. We're going to examine the evidence, the anomalies, the things that make archaeologists shift uncomfortably in their chairs. And we're going to ask the most haunting question of all. If 6 civilizations rose and fell before us, leaving barely a trace, what makes us think we're any different? But don't worry. We're going to take this journey slowly, calmly, through the shadows of deep time. Let the mystery wash over you. Let these questions drift through your mind as you drift towards sleep. Because the most profound discoveries often come not in the harsh light of certainty, but in the soft twilight of wondering. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. And let's begin our descent into the forgotten chapters of human history. What if history doesn't move forward in a straight line? What if instead of climbing steadily upward from caves to cities to spaceships, we've been riding a wheel, rising, falling, rising again, civilizations ascending to heights we can barely imagine, then crashing down so completely that barely a whisper of their existence remains. This is the cycle theory, and it's older than almost any idea in human thought. The ancient Hindus understood this deeply. They mapped time itself into vast cosmic cycles called yugas, 4 great ages repeating eternally, like seasons on a scale that makes human lifespans seem like heartbeats. First comes the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age. Humanity lives in harmony, wisdom flows freely, lifespans stretch for thousands of years. Then the Treta Yuga, where virtue begins to decline, conflict emerges, knowledge starts fragmenting. Next, the Dvapara Yuga, where vice and virtue stand in balance. Civilizations rise and grow complex, but corruption takes root. Finally, the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the age of darkness, strife and forgetting. According to the calculations, we're living in a Kali Yuga right now, and when it ends, everything resets. Catastrophe wipes the slate clean, and the cycle begins again with a new golden age built on the ruins of the old. The Greeks had their own version. 5 ages of man descending from perfection. The golden race lived like gods, free from toil and suffering. The Silver Age brought the first decline, then Bronze, when men became violent and warlike. The Heroic Age produced great warriors and legends we still remember. Finally, our age, the Iron Age. Hesiod wrote about it 2,700 years ago, describing a time when fathers would turn against sons, honour would die, and strength would make right. He was describing his own era, but read his words today and they feel uncomfortably familiar. What's striking is how many cultures developed this idea independently. The Maya tracked vast cycles of creation and destruction. The Aztecs believed we were living in the 5th sun, the 5th world, with 4 previous humanities already destroyed by flood, fire, wind, and jaguars. Norse mythology predicted Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, followed by rebirth. Egyptian texts spoke of cycles governed by cosmic forces beyond human control. These weren't primitive peoples making up stories around campfires. These were sophisticated civilizations with advanced astronomy, mathematics, architecture. They were telling us something they believed was true, that we've been here before, that we'll be here again. Modern science mostly dismisses this as mythology. History is linear, we're told. Progress moves in one direction. But recently, some researchers have started asking uncomfortable questions. In 2018, 2 scientists proposed what they called the Silurian hypothesis. Named after a Doctor Who episode about intelligent reptiles, it asks a simple question with profound implications. If an industrial civilization existed on Earth millions of years ago, would we even know? Think about that for a moment. Plate tectonics recycle the Earth's crust every few 100 million years. Erosion scrubs surfaces clean. Even our most permanent structures, concrete, steel, glass, would decompose into unrecognizable components given enough time. A city could become a thin layer of unusual sediment. A civilization could become a slight chemical anomaly in rock strata. After 100 million years, almost nothing would remain. Maybe some plastics, some radioactive isotopes, a brief spike in carbon dioxide levels frozen in ice cores. That's it. Everything else would simply vanish, ground to dust by the relentless machinery of geological time. So the cycle theory asks us to consider a possibility that modern archaeology can't quite dismiss and can't quite prove, that we're not the first, that others came before, rose high, fell hard, and disappeared so completely that we're left with nothing but myths, anomalies, and that nagging feeling that we've forgotten something important. Before Atlantis captured the Western imagination, before ancient astronaut theories and alternative archaeology became mainstream, there was another lost continent that haunted the minds of 19th century scientists and mystics alike. They called it Lemuria. And unlike Atlantis, which came to us through Plato's philosophical writings, Lemuria emerged from something far more unexpected. A scientific puzzle about why lemurs live where they do. Picture this. It's 1864, and British zoologist Philip Sclater is staring at a map, trying to solve a problem that's been bothering naturalists for decades. Lemurs, those strange primates with their enormous eyes and long striped tails, they live in Madagascar. That makes sense. Islands often have unique wildlife, but lemur fossils also turn up in India, and that makes no sense at all. There's an entire ocean between these places. Darwin's new theory of evolution is still shocking the scientific establishment, and everyone's trying to figure out how species spread across the globe. Sclater looks at his map again. Madagascar, India, thousands of miles of open water, no land bridge that anyone knows about, unless there used to be one. So, he proposes something radical. What if there was once a continent connecting Madagascar and India? A vast landmass that spanned much of the Indian Ocean, providing a pathway for lemurs and other species to spread before it sank beneath the waves. He names this hypothetical continent Lemuria after the very primates whose distribution it's meant to explain. For a brief period, mainstream science takes the idea seriously. The theory of plate tectonics won't be established for another century, and scientists are still figuring out how continents and oceans actually work. If land could rise up from the sea to form mountains, why couldn't it also sink back down? But then something interesting happens. The spiritualists and occultists get hold of the idea. By the 1880s, Lemuria transforms from a zoological hypothesis into something far more mystical. Madame Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, incorporates Lemuria into her elaborate theories of human spiritual evolution. According to her teachings, Lemuria wasn't just a continent. It was home to the third root race of humanity, beings who existed millions of years ago, 7 feet tall with 4 arms and an eye in the back of their heads that gave them psychic abilities. Now, modern science has definitively shown that Lemuria, at least as Sclater imagined it, never existed. Plate tectonics explains lemur distribution far more simply. Madagascar was once part of the African continent and drifted away carrying its unique cargo of primitive primates. The Indian Ocean has been mapped, sonar has scanned the depths, and there's no sunken continent hiding down there. Case closed, except not quite. Because while Victorian scientists were inventing lost continents to explain lemur distribution, the vast Pacific Ocean was hiding genuine mysteries, stories that indigenous peoples have been telling for thousands of years, stories about lands that sank beneath the waves. The oral traditions of Pacific Islanders are filled with memories of catastrophe. Hawaiian legends speak of great floods that covered the land. Maori traditions in New Zealand describe ancestors who fled sinking islands. Polynesian navigators, who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean with nothing but stars and wave patterns to guide them, they maintained detailed knowledge of islands and reefs, some of which no longer appear above the surface. For generations, Western scholars dismissed these stories as mythology, just creation myths and flood legends, nothing more. But then in 1985, a dive instructor named Kihachiro Arataki discovered something off the coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost point of Japan. At a depth of about 100 feet, he found what looked like massive stone structures. terraces, platforms, steps carved into rock. The formations stretch for hundreds of feet, with what appear to be straight edges, right angles, carved channels and pillars. Some sections look like pyramids, others like amphitheatres or ceremonial platforms. There are features that look remarkably like stairs, with regular steps rising at consistent angles. The discovery sparked immediate controversy that continues today. Geologists, led by Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University, argue the formations are entirely natural. Yonaguni's geology is characterized by parallel layers of sandstone and mudstone that fracture along straight plains. Erosion and tectonic activity could have created features that look artificial but aren't. It's a case of humans seeing patterns where none exist, faces in clouds, order in chaos. But marine geologist Professor Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyu spent years diving at Yonaguni. He maintains that while the base formations are natural, there's clear evidence of human modification. Tool marks on some surfaces, symmetrical holes that look drilled, the arrangement of certain blocks that seems too precise to be random. The debate matters because of the timeline. If the structures are artificial, they would have been above water during the last ice age when sea levels were 300 feet lower than today. That means they'd be at least 10,000 years old, possibly much older. This would make them older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Göbekli Tepe, older than any accepted ancient civilization. The problem is dating underwater rock formations with certainty is nearly impossible without finding artifacts, tools, or other clear signs of human activity. And Yonaguni has yielded nothing definitive. No pottery shards, no tool marks that everyone agrees are artificial, no bones or remains of the people who might have built there. So, we're left with something maddeningly ambiguous. Formations that look artificial enough to spark decades of investigation, but natural enough that mainstream archaeology can dismiss them without losing sleep. And Yonaguni isn't alone. Similar underwater structures appear throughout the Pacific, off the coast of Okinawa, near Taiwan, around some of the Micronesian islands, all of them showing features that look suspiciously organized, all of them hotly debated, all of them sitting right at depths that correspond to Ice Age coastlines. If there was a Lemurian civilization, and let's be clear, this is speculation, not established fact, it wouldn't have existed where Sclater imagined it. Not in the middle of the Indian Ocean. But what about the coastal regions of a Pacific world that looked completely different 12,000 years ago? When sea levels were hundreds of feet lower and vast areas now underwater were dry land, prime real estate for human settlement. Consider what we know for certain. Humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago. That required crossing significant stretches of open water, even when sea levels were at their lowest. Someone built boats, developed navigation skills, and successfully colonized a new continent. The ancestors of Pacific Islanders were master seafarers who navigated thousands of miles of open ocean without compasses or maps, using only their knowledge of stars, currents, and wave patterns. What if there were coastal civilizations throughout the Pacific during the Ice Age? Not spiritually advanced giants with psychic powers, but real human societies that developed sophisticated maritime cultures over thousands of years. They wouldn't have left much evidence. Coastal settlements get destroyed by rising seas, wooden structures decay, stone that gets submerged becomes nearly impossible to distinguish from natural formations. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, sometimes catastrophically fast during periods of rapid melt, entire coastlines would have vanished in generations. Islands would have become reefs, valleys would have become bays, and people, the survivors, would have carried stories of the lands that sank, the homes that were swallowed by the sea. Maybe Lemuria as imagined by Victorian mystics never existed. But something was out there in the Pacific during the Ice Age. something that left traces too ambiguous to prove but too persistent to ignore completely. And that mystery invites you deeper into the question, what else have we forgotten? What other civilizations might have risen and fallen before recorded history began? Let those thoughts drift through your mind as we journey next to the most famous lost civilization of them all. The most famous lost civilization isn't just a myth whispered around campfires. It comes to us from one of the most respected philosophers in human history, writing in excruciating detail about an empire that supposedly vanished 9,000 years before his own time. Plato wasn't writing fantasy fiction when he composed the Timaeus and Critias around 360 BCE. He was presenting what he claimed was historical fact, passed down through Egyptian priests to the Greek statesman Solon, and eventually to Plato himself, and the story he told was extraordinary. According to Plato, Atlantis existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean. The island was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, making it roughly the size of a small continent. At its heart was a magnificent capital city, designed in a pattern that has captured imaginations for millennia. Concentric rings of water and land, alternating like a target, with channels connecting them to the sea. The outermost ring of water was 3 stades wide, roughly 600 feet. The rings of land between the waterways were even wider, and the whole elaborate construction was surrounded by a plain that stretched 3,000 stades in one direction and 2,000 in the other. But it wasn't just the architecture that made Atlantis remarkable. It was what they could do. Plato describes a civilization that had mastered engineering on a scale that would impress modern builders. They carved tunnels through solid rock to connect their rings of water. They built bridges and docks and massive walls. The walls themselves were covered in metals, brass on the outer wall, tin on the middle wall, and orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato says gleamed like fire on the innermost wall surrounding the citadel. They had hot and cold running water fed by natural springs. They had constructed elaborate baths, gardens, and exercise grounds. They had a navy of 1,200 ships and an army that could field tens of thousands of chariots. This wasn't a primitive society scratching out survival. This was an empire, sophisticated and powerful, controlling territories across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. According to Plato, Atlantean influence reached as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia, modern-day Tuscany. They were by any measure a superpower, and for a long time they were stable. The early Atlanteans, Plato tells us, were virtuous. They valued wisdom over wealth, character over conquest. They possessed what he calls a divine nature, inherited from their founding god, Poseidon himself. The god of the sea had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, and from their union came 10 sons who became the first kings of Atlantis, dividing the realm into 10 kingdoms but ruling together in harmony. But here's where the story gets dark. Over thousands of years that divine nature began to fade. The Atlanteans began to change. They started valuing the wrong things, wealth instead of wisdom, power instead of peace, conquest instead of cooperation. They became proud, arrogant, convinced of their own superiority. They looked at the rest of the world and saw weakness, territories to be conquered, peoples to be subjugated. They built their navy not for trade but for war, and they launched invasions across the Mediterranean, attacking established civilizations, trying to expand their empire even further. This is when they made their fatal mistake. They attacked Athens. Now this is 9,000 years before Plato's time, so we're talking about an Athens that existed long before the classical city we know from history. Plato calls it Proto-Athens and describes it as a society of warrior philosophers, perfectly organized according to the principles he would later outline in the Republic. And somehow, against impossible odds, this proto-Athens defeated the Atlantean invasion. They pushed back the empire that had conquered so much of the known world. But the gods weren't finished. Zeus, king of the Olympians, looked down at what the Atlanteans had become, how far they had fallen from their original virtue, and decided enough was enough. He called together the other gods, and they passed judgment. The punishment was absolute. In a single day and night of catastrophic destruction, the entire island of Atlantis was swallowed by earthquakes and floods. The civilization that had taken thousands of years to build disappeared beneath the waves. Every building, every ship, every person gone. The sea above where Atlantis had stood became unnavigable, choked with mud and debris, and the world moved on, carrying only fragmentary memories of the empire that had defied the gods. That's the story Plato told. But here's the question that has haunted researchers for 2,400 years. Was any of it real? Plato insisted it was history, not allegory. He specifically states that this is a true account, not a philosophical parable. But no other ancient writer mentions Atlantis, not one. Plato's own student, Aristotle, apparently believed his teacher had invented the whole thing to illustrate political philosophy. For centuries that was the accepted view. Atlantis was metaphor, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and corruption. Then modern geology happened, and things got complicated, because around 11,600 years ago, right around the time Plato said Atlantis was destroyed, something catastrophic actually did happen to the planet. The last ice age ended suddenly, not gradually. Temperatures spiked. Ice sheets that had covered continents for 100,000 years collapsed in what geologists call meltwater pulses. Sea levels rose dramatically, in some places more than 400 feet. Coastlines that had been above water for millennia vanished beneath the waves. Any coastal civilization that existed at that time would have been devastated. The Younger Dryas period, lasting from about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, was particularly chaotic. The climate swung wildly between glacial and interglacial conditions. Some scientists think a comet or asteroid impact triggered it, blasting debris into the atmosphere and causing rapid cooling followed by rapid warming. There's evidence of massive wildfires across multiple continents, extinction events that wiped out dozens of large mammal species, flooding on a scale that would make the biblical deluge look modest. If there was an advanced coastal civilization during this period, it probably didn't survive, and we probably wouldn't find much evidence of it today. 400 feet of sea level rise is a lot. Anything built near the coast 12,000 years ago is now deep underwater, buried under millennia of sediment. We've barely explored the ocean floor. The deep continental shelves where Ice Age humans would have lived are largely unmapped. We find surprises occasionally. Submerged settlements, ancient harbours, structures that shouldn't exist according to accepted timelines. So where was Atlantis if it was real? Theories abound. Some researchers point to the Mediterranean, suggesting the volcanic destruction of Santorini around 1600 BCE as a possible inspiration, even though the timing doesn't match Plato's account. Others look to the Riche structure in Mauritania, a circular geological formation in the Sahara that eerily matches Plato's description of concentric rings. Some propose Antarctica, suggesting that before it was covered in ice, it might have supported civilization. A few bold researchers even suggest Atlantis was in the Atlantic, exactly where Plato said, now resting on the ocean floor between Europe and America. The truth is, we don't know. Maybe Atlantis was a real place, a memory of something that existed before the great floods reshaped the world. Maybe it was allegory, Plato's way of teaching about political corruption and divine justice. Or maybe it was something stranger, a fragment of genuinely ancient knowledge, passed down through so many generations that truth and myth became impossible to separate. Maybe the details got confused, locations changed, timelines compressed, but the core memory remained. A memory of a civilization that rose high, fell to corruption, and was destroyed by forces beyond human control. What we do know is this: the catastrophes Plato described, the earthquakes and floods that swallowed Atlantis, those actually happened. The time frame he mentioned, roughly 11,600 years ago, corresponds precisely with one of the most dramatic climate events in recent geological history. And the idea that some knowledge, some memory of what came before survived the cataclysm and was passed down through myths and legends, that's not unreasonable. It's actually exactly what you'd expect if earlier civilizations really existed and were destroyed. Whether those earlier civilizations looked anything like Plato's Atlantis, we may never know. The Greeks had a word for paradise. They called it Hyperborea, the land beyond Boreas, beyond the north wind, beyond the frozen breath that swept down from the top of the world. And according to their oldest stories, it wasn't a frozen wasteland up there. It was perfect, a temperate paradise where the sun shone for 6 months straight, where people lived for 1,000 years without aging, where sickness and war were unknown, where the god Apollo himself would retreat every winter to rest among a people so blessed, so perfect, that even the immortals envied them. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like typical mythology, beautiful stories to explain the unknown, metaphors for spiritual concepts, nothing more. But here's where it gets strange. The Greeks didn't treat Hyperborea like other mythical places. They didn't put it in the realm of gods or in some unreachable dimension. They put it on Earth. Specifically, they put it at the North Pole, and they were oddly specific about the details. The Hyperboreans, according to Pindar and Herodotus, weren't gods. They were humans. Incredibly long-lived humans who had somehow created a perfect society in the far north. They worshipped Apollo with continuous festivals of music and dance. They knew neither disease nor old age. They simply lived until they grew tired of life, at which point they would adorn themselves with flowers and leap joyfully from a sacred cliff into the sea. Even their deaths were beautiful. The Greeks claimed to have contact with them, or at least indirect contact. Sacred offerings supposedly travelled from Hyperborea to Apollo's temple at Delos, passed from tribe to tribe across vast distances. Some ancient writers even claim that Greek travellers had visited Hyperborea and returned with tales of its wonders. But the most intriguing part isn't the mythology itself. It's what happens when you look at old maps, really old maps, the kind that weren't supposed to exist with the level of detail they show. Several medieval and Renaissance maps, some claiming to be copies of much more ancient sources, show something remarkable at the North Pole, not ice, land. 4 large islands surrounding an open sea with a massive mountain at the centre. The Mercator map of 1595 shows this clearly. 4 rivers flowing from the central mountain, dividing the polar region into quadrants. And here's the thing that should make you pause. These maps were made centuries before anyone had actually explored the Arctic. Centuries before we knew what was really up there under all that ice. How did they know to put land at the North Pole? Why the specific configuration of 4 islands? The standard explanation is that cartographers were simply filling in blank spaces with imagination, creating symmetrical patterns because they looked nice. But some of these maps include details that match geological features we've only discovered in the last few decades, using ground-penetrating radar beneath the Arctic ice. Features that suggest there are indeed islands and mountain ranges under there. Features that have been buried under ice for thousands of years. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if Hyperborea wasn't mythology? What if it was memory? Memory of a time when the North Pole wasn't frozen, when the far north was temperate enough for human civilization. Impossible, you might say. The Arctic has been frozen for millions of years, except that might not be entirely true. There's a theory, controversial but persistent, called crustal displacement. The idea is that Earth's crust can shift relative to its core, moving continents and oceans to different latitudes. Not slowly over millions of years like plate tectonics, but relatively rapidly over thousands of years. If this happened, a region that was once temperate could suddenly find itself at the pole, while the former polar region could end up in a more moderate climate. Charles Hapgood proposed this in the 1950s, and even Einstein found the theory intriguing enough to write the foreword to Hapgood's book. The idea never gained mainstream acceptance, but it would explain a lot. It would explain why we find evidence of temperate forests buried under Antarctic ice. It would explain why we find frozen mammoths in Siberia with undigested temperate vegetation still in their stomachs, as if they were flash frozen while eating. It would explain those impossible maps showing Antarctica without ice, showing accurate coastlines that we've only been able to confirm with modern sonar. And it would explain Hyperborea. If the North Pole was once positioned differently, if the region we now call the Arctic was once temperate, then a civilization could have existed there. A highly developed civilization that enjoyed a perfect climate, long-growing seasons, abundant resources. A civilization that might have seemed like paradise to anyone who visited from harsher climates. But then something happened. Something catastrophic. Around 12,800 years ago, something slammed into Earth's atmosphere. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. A thin layer of platinum and other rare elements that shouldn't be there spread across the northern hemisphere. Nanodiamonds that only form under extreme heat and pressure. Magnetic spherules that indicate massive impact events. Charcoal layers showing continent-wide wildfires. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The theory suggests that a comet, possibly multiple fragments, struck the ice sheets covering North America and possibly northern Europe. The impacts would have been devastating. Instant vaporization of cubic miles of ice, superheated steam exploding into the atmosphere, massive flooding as meltwater poured into the oceans, and most critically for any civilization in the far north, a catastrophic climate shift. Within decades, maybe faster, global temperatures plummeted. The blast threw so much debris into the atmosphere that it triggered an ice age that lasted over 1,000 years. We call it the Younger Dryas cold period, a sudden return to glacial conditions right in the middle of the warming trend that was bringing Earth out of the last ice age. For any civilization in the northern latitudes, it would have been apocalyptic, temperatures dropping by 20 or 30 degrees in a single generation, the sun dimming behind clouds of ashen vapor, growing seasons collapsing. And if crustal displacement happened at the same time, triggered perhaps by the impact itself, then regions that had been temperate could suddenly find themselves at the pole. Hyperborea, if it existed, wouldn't have had a chance. The archaeological evidence from Siberia is tantalizing but fragmentary. Strange stone structures buried under permafrost, tools and artifacts that seem more sophisticated than they should be for their apparent age. Ancient mines dug deep into mountains that have been frozen solid for millennia. Who was mining up there? When? And what happened to them? Most of this evidence is dismissed or ignored because it doesn't fit our timeline of human development. We're told that sophisticated civilizations only emerged after the Ice Age ended, only in the last 5,000 or 6,000 years in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. But what if that's wrong? What if sophisticated civilizations existed before, in places that are now impossible to explore because they're buried under miles of ice or permafrost? The Greeks remembered Hyperborea for thousands of years. They passed down detailed descriptions of its location, its people, its culture. Why would they maintain such specific traditions about a place that never existed? Unless it did exist. Unless Hyperborea was real, a northern paradise that vanished when the world froze, leaving only myths and impossible maps as evidence that it had ever been there at all. While Atlantis captured the imagination of the Western world and Lemuria haunted the Indian Ocean, another lost continent was waiting to be discovered in the records of the past. Or perhaps, more accurately, waiting to be remembered. This one had a different origin story, a different champion, and a different claim to make about humanity's forgotten heritage. This one wasn't just another lost civilization. According to its discoverer, it was the first, the original motherland from which all other cultures, all other peoples, all other civilizations had descended. Its name was Mu. The story begins not with ancient philosophers or mystical channeling, but with a British colonel stationed in India during the 1880s. James Churchward was a military man, an engineer, a researcher with no particular interest in lost continents or alternative history, at least not until a Hindu priest showed him something that would consume the rest of his life. According to Churchward, the priest revealed the existence of ancient tablets, hidden away in temple vaults, written in a language so old that only a handful of people on Earth could still read it. The language of the Nehals, a priestly brotherhood that had supposedly served the civilization of Mutanes of thousands of years before the rise of Egypt or Sumeria or any civilization historians recognized. The priest agreed to teach Churchward this dead language, and what Churchward claimed to have learned from those tablets rewrote human history entirely, not just adding a lost civilization to the timeline, but placing it at the very beginning, making it the source from which everything else flowed. Mu, according to the Nehal tablets, had existed in the Pacific Ocean. Not the Atlantic like Atlantis, not the Indian Ocean like Lemuria, but stretching across the vast expanse of the Pacific. A continent roughly the size of South America, extending from somewhere north of Hawaii, down past Easter Island, west toward the Philippines. A landmass that would dwarf Atlantis, that would make Lemuria look like an island chain. And on this massive continent, according to Churchward's translation, lived the first great civilization. Not primitive hunter-gatherers slowly figuring out agriculture, not simple tribal societies gradually developing culture, but a sophisticated, advanced, highly organized empire with a population of 64 million people. They had developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, navigation. They had built cities with populations in the millions. They had created a religious and philosophical system that would later spread to every corner of the globe when Mu's colonies established themselves in other lands. Egypt, India, Babylon, Mayan civilization, all of them, Churchward claimed, were colonies or inheritors of Mu's knowledge. This was the Motherland, the original source. Everything humanity had accomplished since was just an echo of what Mu had achieved first. Now you might be thinking this sounds like exactly the kind of grand, unprovable claim that shows up in alternative history. And you'd be right to be skeptical. Churchward never produced the tablets, never brought other scholars to see them, never provided any verification that they existed at all. When he finally published his findings decades later in 1926 in a book called The Lost Continent of Mu, he had only his word, his drawings, and his interpretations to offer as evidence. But here's where the story gets more interesting. Because unlike Atlantis, which exists primarily in a single ancient text, or Lemuria, which was theoretical from the start, Mu had something else going for it. Physical evidence scattered across the Pacific. Not proof exactly, but anomalies, mysteries, structures that seemed too advanced, too precisely engineered, too deliberately placed to be the work of the primitive island cultures mainstream archaeology attributed them to. Start with Easter Island, Rapa Nui, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, sitting alone in the eastern Pacific over 1,000 miles from the nearest population centre. And yet, somehow, The people who lived there managed to carve and transport nearly 900 massive stone statues, some weighing over 80 tons, and erect them on platforms around the island. The Moai aren't just impressive for their size, they're impressive for their uniformity, their precision, the engineering required to move them from the quarry to their final positions. How did a small island population with limited resources accomplish this? Mainstream archaeology says they used rope, wooden rollers, coordinated labour over generations. Maybe. But Churchward and others pointed to the Moai as remnants of something larger, as monuments built by people who remembered living on a greater land, who were commemorating ancestors from a vanished civilization. Then there's Nan Madol, off the coast of Pohnpei in Micronesia, an artificial archipelago of nearly 100 artificial islets built on a coral reef. Massive basalt logs, some weighing several tons, stacked like enormous Lincoln logs to create temples, tombs, and administrative buildings. Construction estimates suggest it took at least 1,000 years to build, but here's the question nobody can quite answer satisfactorily. Why? Why would a relatively small island population invest that much effort into building on a reef instead of on land? What were they commemorating? What were they trying to preserve? Local legend says Nan Madol was built by twin sorcerers using magic to levitate the stones into place, which is obviously mythological, but maybe myths preserve memories of capabilities that once existed and were lost. The Ha'amonga are Maui in Tonga, a massive stone trilithon, 3 coral limestone slabs arranged like a doorway, each weighing between 30 and 40 tons. Nobody knows exactly when it was built or how the stones were transported and erected. Local tradition says it was built by the god Maui, that same trickster deity whose stories appear throughout Polynesian mythology. But tradition also says it marked a gateway, a connection to ancestral homelands in the West. And this is where oral tradition becomes fascinating, because across the Pacific, from Hawaii to New Zealand, from Micronesia to Polynesia, indigenous cultures preserve stories of ancestral homelands that sank beneath the waves. The Hawaiians speak of Kahupo'okain, a floating island homeland from which their ancestors voyaged. Tahitian legends mention Hawaii, not the modern Hawaii but an ancient motherland. Maori traditions in New Zealand reference Hawaii, the place of origin, the land left behind in the distant past. Are these all racial memories of Mu, or are they simply the natural mythology that develops when seafaring peoples settle islands and maintain oral histories of migration? Mainstream scholarship says the latter, but Churchward saw patterns. Linguistic similarities across Pacific cultures, architectural styles that seem to share common principles, religious symbols that appeared in places separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Then came the catastrophe. According to the Nakel tablets as interpreted by Churchward, Mu didn't decline gradually. It died suddenly, catastrophically, in a series of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that tore the continent apart and sent it sliding beneath the Pacific in a single terrible night. The Pacific Ring of Fire, that enormous chain of volcanoes and earthquake zones that circles the Pacific Ocean, became Mu's graveyard. Gas chambers beneath the continent collapsed. The land fragmented, the ocean rushed in, and 64 million people, an entire civilization, the motherland itself, vanished beneath the waves, leaving only scattered islands and scattered survivors to preserve fragments of memory. This would have happened, Churchward calculated, around 12,000 years ago, the same time frame Plato gave for Atlantis' destruction, the same period when sea levels were rising dramatically as the last ice age ended. Coincidence? Or evidence that multiple advanced civilizations were destroyed simultaneously by some global catastrophe? The geological evidence doesn't support a sunken continent in the Pacific, at least not in the last million years, but the mysteries remain. The massive stone structures, the oral traditions, the inexplicable similarities between cultures that supposedly never contacted each other. Maybe Mu wasn't a continent. Maybe it was something else, a network of advanced maritime cultures, a sophisticated seafaring civilization that connected the Pacific Islands thousands of years before anyone thought possible. Or maybe it was exactly what Churchward claimed: the Motherland, the source, the first civilization, now sleeping beneath the waves, waiting to be remembered. Before there was Atlantis, before the great stone circles and pyramids, before written history even begins to whisper, many traditions say there was another world, a world so old it sits behind memory, like a dream you almost recall when you first wake up, then lose as the day goes on. Later ages would call it the Antediluvian world, the world before the flood. If you listen to the oldest stories from almost anywhere on Earth, you start to hear the same pattern: different names, different gods, different heroes, but the same shape: a golden age, a rise in power and knowledge, a crossing of some invisible line, and then water, endless, merciless water. In Mesopotamia, scribes etched it into clay as the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The gods decide that humankind has become too noisy, too troublesome, too dangerous. One man is warned to build a massive boat, seal it with pitch, bring aboard his family, artisans, and the seed of all living things. The flood comes, rips cities from their foundations, scrapes the landscape clean. When it finally recedes, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are sent out to see if dry land has returned. A sacrifice is offered. A new world begins. Thousands of years later, a version of this story reappears in the Hebrew Bible as Noah and the Ark. The details shift. The reason becomes human wickedness. The builder is different. The dimensions of the boat are carefully described, but the structure is the same. A warning, a vessel, 40 days of water, a dove, a mountain, a covenant that things will not be quite like this again. But the echo doesn't stop there, doesn't. In India, Vishnu appears as a fish to warn Manu of an oncoming deluge and instructs him to build a boat, tying it to the horn of the divine fish to be guided through the chaos. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a world-destroying flood sent by Zeus. In ancient China, heroes like Yu the Great struggle to tame waters that have drowned the land. Among the Maya and Aztec, previous ages of the world end in water and darkness. In the Pacific, Polynesian traditions speak of giant waves and drowned lands. Even in the high Andes, where the ocean seems impossibly far away, stories tell of a great water that once swallowed the valleys and left only a few people clinging to mountaintops. Anthropologists sometimes call this convergence coincidence, or mythic logic. Floods are common, they say. Rivers overflow. Coasts are battered by storms. People remember, and the memory grows into legend. That is certainly part of it. But when stories from cultures that never met, separated by oceans and millennia, all describe a time when the entire world seemed to drown, you can't help but wonder if there was something more. So what was this antediluvian world that so many myths insist existed before? According to later traditions, it was strangely different from ours. The Book of Genesis hints at long lifespans, with patriarchs living hundreds of years in an environment that felt more like myth than history. Some Jewish and early Christian texts imagine a world with a gentler climate, with mists rising from the ground instead of rain, with a firmament of waters above and below. Other cultures describe something similar in their own language. In some Mesopotamian and Near Eastern traditions, pre-flood kings rule for impossibly long reigns, measured in tens of thousands of years. The Sumerian king list, a curious cuneiform document, calmly records antediluvian rulers whose reigns last longer than entire civilizations. After the flood, those reign lengths shrink abruptly to something more recognizably human. It's as if there's a line drawn across time. Before the flood, a different order of reality. After the flood, our world. In these stories, the inhabitants of that old world are not quite like us either. The Hebrew Bible refers to the Nephilim, mysterious beings described as giants and mighty men of renown. The text is tantalizingly brief. It tells of sons of God who took human women as wives, and of offspring who became legendary heroes or tyrants, depending on the interpretation. Later commentators debated for centuries. Were these fallen angels, ancient kings, foreign nobles, something else entirely? Outside the Bible, similar figures appear. In Greek mythology, the age before the great cataclysms is populated by titans and giants, beings of enormous size and power who war with the gods and reshape the land. In the traditions of the Americas, there are stories of giant ancestors, some benevolent, some terrifying, who lived before a great flood changed everything. In parts of northern Europe, sagas describe Jotnar, frost giants, and primeval beings who once walked a younger Earth. These stories might be symbolic. They might be exaggerated memories of tall warrior elites, or metaphors for the awe people felt toward their distant ancestors. Or perhaps they are dim reflections of real populations, unusually large humans, or even encounters with the last remnants of archaic hominin species that lingered long enough to be remembered in myth. We don't know, but the pattern is hard to ignore. A sense that before the waters came, the world hosted beings who were more than ordinary, for good or ill. While the old texts talk about gods and giants, the rocks and sediments tell their own quieter story. At the end of the last ice age, between roughly 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, Earth went through one of the most dramatic natural transitions in our species' experience. Massive ice sheets that had locked up incredible amounts of water began to collapse. Sea levels rose not by centimetres, but by more than 100 metres over several thousand years, with pulses that may have been startlingly fast on human timescales. Imagine living on a coastal plain that has been home to your ancestors for as long as anyone can remember. One generation, the shoreline creeps in a little. The next, storms carve away more land. Then, in a span of a few centuries, entire river valleys are swallowed. Sacred sites vanish under the surf. Fishing grounds migrate into deeper water. Villages are abandoned again and again, each time a little farther inland. To someone living through that, it wouldn't feel like gradual sea level rise. It would feel like the world itself was flooding. Geologists find evidence of catastrophic outburst floods as well. Glacial lakes bursting their icy dams and releasing walls of water that strip landscapes bare in days. In North America, in Siberia, in Europe, there are scars of torrents that would have looked apocalyptic to anyone standing in their path. It's not hard to imagine such events seeding stories that would be retold, embellished, and woven into grand narratives of a single, world-encompassing deluge. One particularly evocative idea is the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. According to this model, at the end of the Ice Age, the Black Sea basin may have been a large, isolated freshwater lake, ringed by early farming communities. As global sea levels rose, Mediterranean waters eventually overtopped the natural barrier at the Bosporus. When that threshold finally failed, saltwater poured in with extraordinary force, flooding valleys, drowning settlements, and rapidly transforming the lake into the much larger, deeper sea we know today. Not everyone agrees on the speed or scale of this event, but if anything like it occurred, the people who witnessed it would have remembered. Their children and grandchildren would have remembered. Long after the details were lost, the memory of a rising sea that devoured a world would remain. Similar ideas have been proposed for the Mediterranean itself, periods when sea level rise and tectonic shifts transformed coastlines, swallowed islands, and forced entire cultures to move. Beneath the waves of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia lies an entire drowned world of ancient shorelines, river deltas, and potential human habitats. If people settled there, and it would have been prime real estate, they would have built, farmed, traded, and told stories. Then the waters came, and those stories became flood myths. If there was a fifth civilization, an antediluvian culture that flourished before the great inundations, much of its physical trace would now lie under hundreds of feet of water. Coastal cities, harbours, temples, and observatories could have been erased, their stones tumbled and buried under sediments. Early experiments in agriculture and animal domestication might have begun in these low, fertile coastal plains, only to be forced uphill as the seas advanced, leaving us to discover the later inland stages and assume that's where it all began. Maybe what was lost wasn't just land but knowledge, techniques for navigating coastlines that no longer exist, stories tied to constellations as they rose over horizons that are now seabeds, calendars based on seasonal fish migrations in estuaries that have been drowned, even technologies that were sophisticated for their time, complex boat building, coastal architecture, intricate trade networks, could vanish almost without a trace once their infrastructure was submerged. What we see in the archaeological record might be only the inland half of the story, the half that retreated successfully, the half that survived. And hovering over that gap between what we know and what we can only guess at are the myths of Nephilim and giants, of pre-flood sages and men of renown, of gods who walk among humans and then withdraw, leaving behind a shattered world and the faint warning that this has all happened before. Whether the antediluvian world was a metaphor, a memory, or something in between, it leaves us with a haunting possibility that our current civilization is not the first to stand on shorelines and watch the waters rise, that others long ago faced their own turning of the age. Some adapted, some vanished, and some perhaps chose to leave messages in stories instead of stone, hoping that when the next cycle came, someone would be listening. By the time we reach the sixth civilization in this story, something has changed in a way that's hard to ignore. For hundreds of thousands of years, stones were just stones, useful, yes, for tools and shelters and hearths. But then, almost suddenly on the timescale of geology, stones begin to move. Not pebbles, not hand-sized rocks, but monsters. Blocks weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons, lifted, stacked, carved, aligned, shaped into patterns that seem to talk to the sky. The traces of this civilization are scattered across the planet like fragments of a broken mirror. Each shard reflects the same strange pattern. Massive stones, impossible precision, alignments to stars, solstices, equinoxes, and all of it emerging long before our official timelines say it should have been possible. Start with the most famous of these puzzles, sitting on the edge of the Sahara, staring forever toward the rising sun. The Great Pyramid of Giza looks familiar from pictures, but the numbers behind it are quietly unsettling. Its base is almost perfectly level, off by only a few centimeters across more than 13 acres. The sides face the 4 cardinal directions, with a precision that modern surveyors struggle to match. True north, true south, true east, true west. Not approximately, almost exactly. How do you do that without satellites, without lasers, without GPS? Official explanations talk about careful observation of stars, about plumb bobs and sighting rods and generations of trial and error, and that may be all it was. Patient, brilliant, relentless human work. But the more you look, the more questions creep in. The dimensions of the pyramid encode ratios that seem eerily familiar. The relationship between its height and the perimeter of its base approximates 2 pi. as if someone had folded the circle of the heavens into a square of stone. The shafts inside the structure point towards specific stars as they would have appeared thousands of years ago: Orion, Sirius, Draco. As though the building itself were a frozen conversation with the night sky. Mainstream archaeology sees this as the pinnacle of Old Kingdom Egyptian engineering, the product of a powerful state and a huge labour force. But some researchers, some dreamers, see something older behind it. They imagine inherited plans, hand-me-down knowledge from a much earlier tradition. A blueprint not entirely understood by the people who followed it, like a child carefully tracing an image they didn't draw. And then you look away from Egypt, and the pattern refuses to fade. Half a world away, high in the thin air above Cusco in Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman grip a hillside with a kind of stone gravity that seems almost alive. The blocks are not neat rectangles. They're wildly irregular, each one with many faces and angles, yet they fit together with such precision that you can't slide a razor blade between them. No mortar, no concrete, just contact, edge to edge, curve to curve, like the pieces of a 3D jigsaw puzzle designed by someone who hated straight lines. Some of these stones weigh over 100 tons. They've been quarried, transported, raised, and locked into place with a complexity that suggests not just brute force, but intimate knowledge of stone behaviour, how it fractures, how it settles, how it weathers over centuries. The official story attributes the visible walls to the Inca, master builders in their own right. But even among local traditions there are whispers that the foundations are older, that the Inca inherited, restored, and expanded something that was already ancient, a memory of an earlier phase of the builders, half remembered in myth as giants or gods. Travel a little farther across the Andean plateau to a windswept place near Lake Titicaca called Pumapunku. Here, the stones look different, but the mystery deepens. Huge blocks of andesite and sandstone are shaped into crisp right angles, complex grooves, and precise interlocking forms. Some resemble giant machine parts more than fallen temple walls. The cuts are so straight, the corners so sharp, that they seem to demand tools and techniques far beyond what we usually associate with prehistoric stoneworking. Archaeologists propose copper tools, abrasion with sand and patience, ingenious but simple methods, and that might be enough. Human ingenuity has always been better than we give it credit for. Yet when you lie awake at night and let your mind wander, you can't help picturing a different scene, an older workshop, a different language, a tradition of building passed from teacher to apprentice for thousands of years, then abruptly cut off. And if we push even further back in time, the sixth civilization becomes harder to dodge. On a hill in southeastern Turkey, buried for thousands of years under deliberate layers of soil, stands Göbekli Tepe. When it was first excavated, it scrambled the neat timeline of human development that had sat comfortably in textbooks for decades. Stone circles, carved pillars, animal reliefs, a ritual complex dated to around 12,000 years ago, long before cities, long before writing, long before agriculture was supposed to take off. By our old story, hunter-gatherers were still supposed to be wandering the landscape with simple tools and simple camps. But here they were, hauling multi-ton pillars, designing stone circles with geometric regularity, carving foxes, snakes, birds, abstract symbols. Not building for survival, but for meaning, for ceremony, for something sacred. Some researchers believe Göbekli Tepe was a catalyst that pushed humans towards settled life. The temple came first, then the village to support it. Others go a step further and suggest it might be the remnant of a much older tradition, a single surviving node of a lost network of sacred sites, a lonely lighthouse still shining after the fleet that built it had already sunk. and Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, the Pacific, vast stones stand or lie in patterns that echo one another like a recurring dream. Stonehenge in England, with its solstice alignments, the megalithic temples of Malta, some older than the pyramids, dolmens in Korea and India, menhirs in Brittany, standing stones in the Sahara, alignments in the Canary Islands, cyclopean walls in the Mediterranean, eerily reminiscent of Andean masonry. Easter Island's Moai, gigantic heads watching the sea, perched on fitted stone platforms that look strangely familiar if you've seen Peru. Different cultures, different languages, thousands of miles apart, and yet the techniques repeat. Gigantic blocks instead of many small ones. Polygonal masonry instead of simple brick. Astronomical alignments that lock buildings to solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, star risings. A quiet obsession with the sky carved into the ground. Official history explains this as convergent evolution of ideas. People everywhere watch the same sun, the same moon, the same stars. They had the same gravity, the same stone, the same need for stability and ritual. Of course they discover similar solutions. It's a reasonable argument. Maybe it's correct. But there's another possibility that drifts through the edge of consciousness as you drift towards sleep. What if these aren't independent discoveries? What if they're echoes of one tradition? Fragments of a single architectural language spoken around the world by a civilization that came before our written records began. Imagine a culture of builders, not necessarily advanced in the way we think of today. No gleaming metal towers, no humming machines, but advanced in a different direction. Masters of stone, of geometry, of celestial cycles. A people who measures time not in years or decades, but in the slow wobble of Earth's axis, in great cycles of precession lasting 26,000 years. A civilization that rose when the ice sheet still gripped much of the planet, and that watched the coastlines shift as glaciers melted and seas rose. If such a civilization existed, its cities would have mostly vanished. Coastal settlements drowned under hundreds of feet of water. Inland structures eroded, repurposed, buried by time and by the hands of later cultures. But the stones, the biggest stones, would remain. Too massive to move easily, too heavy to recycle, too strange to ignore. So they became sacred, enshrined, adopted by later peoples who wrapped their own myths and rituals around them. The sixth civilization, the builders, might never show up in our textbooks. There may never be enough undeniable evidence to upgrade them from tantalizing possibility to established fact. Yet their shadow lingers in granite and basalt and limestone, in blocks that seem too big, cuts that seem too precise, patterns that seem too consistent across too wide a world. If they were real, something must have scattered them, a catastrophe or a sequence of catastrophes that broke their networks, drowned their coasts, erased their maps. Maybe the end of the last ice age with its rapid sea level rise and sudden climate swings was enough. Maybe there were impacts, floods, earthquakes, volcanic winters layered on top of that. Each disaster erasing another chapter until only the prologue in stone remained. We don't know. We may never know. But when you look at a megalithic wall, at a lone standing stone, at a forgotten circle half swallowed by forest or sand, you're not just looking at rock. You're looking at a question carved into the earth. Who built this first? How old is the knowledge hidden in its angles and alignments? And if there really was a sixth civilization of builders, scattered and silenced by some ancient storm, what does that say about us, the seventh? About what we remember, and what we're still capable of forgetting. If there really were six civilizations before us, something had to end them. Not just the slow erosion of time or the usual rise and fall of empires, but events so violent they snapped history in half. Things that didn't just topple kings, but erased whole coastlines, drowned memories, and turned shining cities into stories about angry gods. To understand those possible endings, we have to meet the destroyers, not as monsters in myths, but as forces in nature. The same universe that allows life to bloom also keeps a silent arsenal of reset buttons. Every now and then, one gets pushed. Start with the simplest and most terrifying, rocks from space. Asteroids and comets don't care about your pyramids or your libraries. They move through the solar system on orbits measured in millions of years, ticking along while entire human histories come and go. Most pass harmlessly by. A few don't. When a large body hits Earth, the energy released can be greater than every nuclear weapon ever built detonating at once. Shockwaves flatten forests. Firestorms circle continents. Dust and vapor surge into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight, shutting down photosynthesis, plunging the world into years of cold and dark. We know this has happened before. The dinosaurs didn't vanish because they were weak or stupid. They were wiped out by a rock that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If that could happen once, it could happen again, not just to animals but to cities, to oceanic trading networks, to whatever came before us. There is a growing suspicion among some scientists that something like this did happen. Not 66 million years ago, but at the edge of human memory. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Picture the end of the last ice age. Massive ice sheets melting, sea levels rising, human hunter-gatherers beginning to settle down, experiment with plants, build more permanent structures. Then, suddenly, the climate slams into reverse. Around 12,800 years ago, global temperatures plummet again. Glaciers stop retreating and start growing. Species go extinct. Human cultures that seem to be flourishing suddenly disappear or change dramatically. For a long time, this abrupt cooling was blamed on shifts in ocean currents. But some researchers noticed something strange in the sediment layers that mark the start of this cold snap. Microscopic spherules of melted rock, nanodiamonds, a thin layer rich in platinum and other elements associated with extraterrestrial material. It looked eerily similar to the impact signatures found at other known strike sites. The hypothesis emerged. Maybe a fragmented comet or asteroid exploded over the ice sheets of North America and elsewhere. Not one giant dinosaur killer, but multiple airbursts and impacts, igniting continent-scale wildfires, sending enormous amounts of soot, dust, and water vapor into the atmosphere, enough to disrupt climate, kill off megafauna, and reset early human cultures across the Northern Hemisphere. Is this proven? Not yet. The debate is intense. Some studies support the impact markers, others question them. But the evidence keeps accumulating in unexpected places. Melt glass in Syrian sites, pollen records that show sudden burn events, odd chemical spikes exactly at the Younger Dryas boundary. It's as if different lines of data are whispering the same phrase. Something big happened here. If that something smashed a developing civilization, its ruins would now be buried under meters of sediment or resting beneath drowned shorelines. The stories that survived might remember it only as a flood sent by the gods, or fire in the sky, or a long winter that would not end. But cosmic impacts are only one set of keys on the destruction keyring. Another waits beneath our feet. Supervolcanoes don't look dramatic on the surface. No tall cone, no picturesque peak. Just quiet plains and lakes spreading out across a caldera the size of a small country. But below that calm landscape, oceans of magma simmer. When they erupt, they don't just send lava down a single valley. They throw ash across continents. About 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in Indonesia exploded on a scale almost beyond imagination. Ash layers from this eruption are found from India to East Africa. Some climate models suggest global temperatures may have dropped by several degrees. Sunlight would have dimmed, plants would have struggled, animal populations would have crashed. Some geneticists even linked this event to a human population bottleneck, though that connection is still debated. Now imagine a civilization living before Toba. Coastal cities in the Indian Ocean, stone harbours along drowned river mouths, trade routes crisscrossing warm seas. Overnight their world darkens. Ash storms poison the air and water, monsoons fail, crops wither. Within a few years that entire network could fracture, shrink, forget its own past. The ruins would be ground down, swallowed by jungle, buried under volcanic deposits and rising seas. Yellowstone in North America, Campi Flegrei in Italy, and other caldera systems remind us that Toba was not a one-off. The planet breathes in cycles of fire and quiet. Civilizations that build during the quiet may find themselves suddenly living on the rim of a planetary-scale explosion. Then there are the more speculative destroyers, the ones that sit uncomfortably between geology and mythology. Charles Hapgood proposed that Earth's outer crust might sometimes slip over the deeper mantle, like the rind of an orange rotating around the fruit. Not a slow wander of magnetic poles, but rapid crustal displacement. Continents shifting latitudes in a geological instant. Ice sheets jumping to new locations. Tropical regions freezing. Polar regions thawing. Mainstream geoscience does not support Hapgood's mechanism as he described it. The physics appear problematic. Plate tectonics, not whole crust slippage, explains most of what we see. But the idea of sudden geographic realignment won't quite die. Ancient maps that seem to show ice-free Antarctica, myths of the world tilting on its axis, traditions of stars changing their paths in the sky, all keep the question alive in the popular imagination. If something like a rapid reorientation did occur, whether through crustal motion or some other process, the result would be catastrophic climate chaos. Habitable zones would migrate, shorelines would reconfigure, former heartlands would become unlivable in a single human lifetime. Even without moving continents, the sun itself can act as destroyer. Every so often, our star hurls out colossal eruptions of magnetized plasma known as coronal mass ejections. Most miss us. A few graze our magnetic field and paint the sky with auroras. But occasionally one is aimed directly at Earth. In 1859, the Carrington event sent electrical currents surging through telegraph lines, shocking operators and setting paper on fire. Back then, our technology was made of copper wire and curiosity. Today, it's orbital satellites, global power grids, digital memory. A Carrington-level storm now could fry transformers on multiple continents, blind GPS systems, knock out communication satellites, and plunge advanced societies into sudden extended darkness. Not the end of our species, but perhaps the end of our current way of life. Any earlier civilization dependent on a similar level of technology, even if its tools were made of materials we no longer recognize, would have been equally vulnerable. The stone ruins would remain. The knowledge encoded in fragile systems would not. While the sky throws fire and the ground hides magma, the oceans have their own slow, relentless weapon, rising and falling. During the last ice age, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. Vast coastal plains stretched where waves now roll. River deltas reached far out onto continental shelves. If humans, or anyone else, built cities along those ancient shorelines, those cities are now underwater, cloaked in silt and coral, beyond the reach of casual archaeology. As ice sheets melt, seas rise, shallow coasts flood, estuaries swallow fields, When ice sheets grow, seas fall, exposing new land but abandoning old harbours. Every glacial cycle redraws the map of the world's richest, most habitable zones. Over tens of thousands of years, entire cultural hubs can be submerged, their memory preserved only in stories about gods who walked on lands now lost beneath the waves. This brings us to a final, unsettling possibility. Maybe these catastrophes aren't random at all. Maybe they pulse. Asteroid impacts may follow long orbital cycles of comet streams disturbed by distant planets. Supervolcanoes may erupt in patterns tied to deep mantle processes we barely understand. Solar activity rises and falls over decades, centuries, and perhaps longer rhythms. Ice ages come and go with changes in Earth's orbit and tilt, known as Milankovitch cycles. If different cycles occasionally align, an active sun, a restless mantle, an unlucky pass through a debris-rich region of space, the result could be epochs of heightened catastrophe, windows where the odds of a global reset climb dramatically. Perhaps the rise of a civilization does not guarantee its fall, but merely increases the chances that when one of these windows opens, there is something tall enough to knock down. We don't know how many times this has happened. We don't know how many stories have been erased, how many languages drowned, how many sciences unlearned. We can only trace the scars left on rock, ice, and sediment, and listen to the echo of ancient fears: fire from the sky, smoke from the earth, water swallowing the land. If we are the seventh civilization, then the destroyers have already visited 6 times, and somewhere deep in our collective memory, in our myths of floods and long winters and angry skies, we may still be remembering them. But scattered across that staircase are objects that don't quite fit. Like pebbles in a finely tuned clockwork, they jam the gears of our timelines. Archaeologists have a name for them: out-of-place artifacts. OOP arts. Things that appear centuries or even millennia before they're supposed to exist. Things that whisper very softly that someone, somewhere, knew more than we think they did. Let's start with the one that refuses to be ignored. In 1901, sponge divers off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera stumbled on a shipwreck from around the 1st century BCE. Bronze statues, amphora, fragments of marble, exactly what you'd expect from an ancient cargo ship. But inside a corroded lump of bronze and wood, hidden for nearly 2,000 years, was something else entirely. When X-rays finally penetrated that lump in the 20th century, scientists saw gears, not a few gears, a system of more than 30 interlocking bronze wheels, each tooth cut with mathematical precision. The Antikythera mechanism. Turn a crank on the side and the gears would rotate dials on the front and back, predicting the motions of the sun, the moon, and possibly the planets. It could track eclipses, align with the ancient Greek calendar, even factor in the moon's irregular orbit. It was, in essence, an analog computer built when Rome was still a republic. According to our standard history, technology like this shouldn't appear until at least the 14th century CE, with the first complex astronomical clocks in Europe. Some of the gear arrangements in the Antikythera mechanism are so sophisticated that engineers assumed they were an invention of the Renaissance. Yet here it is, 1,400 years early. Not a sketch, not a myth, a device that somebody designed, machined, assembled, and used. And if we found one, there were probably others. The Antikythera mechanism doesn't just say we were clever, it hints that we're missing an entire tradition of ancient engineering, quietly erased by time, war, and rust. The mechanism is not alone in hinting at a lost map of knowledge. Some of our oldest charts of the world contain details that shouldn't exist. Take the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. At first glance it shows the coastlines of South America and Africa, distorted but recognizable, easy enough to explain by early European voyages. But then your eye drifts south. Along the bottom edge, there appears to be a landmass that looks suspiciously like an ice-free Antarctica. Mainstream scholars debate this fiercely. The shapes might be errors or speculative coastlines invented by the cartographer. Yet the Piri Reis map is not just one oddity. Other early maps, like the Orontius Phineus map from the 16th century, also depict a southern continent with river systems and bays that line up uncannily with modern radar surveys under the Antarctic ice. To map a coastline buried beneath a kilometre of ice, you would need one of two things: modern geophysical equipment, or access to a coastline before it froze over tens of thousands of years ago. Conventional science says humans capable of global navigation didn't exist at that time, that shipbuilding, astronomy and long-distance surveying were still far in the future, and yet these old maps keep floating to the surface, like messages in bottles from a forgotten surveyor. Then there are the small, simple objects that raise even bigger questions. In a museum in Baghdad, before the chaos of recent decades, archaeologists studied a set of curious clay jars from around 2,000 years ago. Each contained a copper cylinder, a central iron rod, and residues that suggested an acidic liquid. Connect them in series, and they can produce a small electric current, the so-called Baghdad batteries. Most academics think they were probably used for something mundane, perhaps storing scrolls, perhaps a simple ritual object. But when chemists experimented with replicas, they discovered that the setup could electroplate thin layers of metal onto other objects. And then, scattered across the ancient world, they found artifacts with impossibly fine gold and silver coatings. Not hammered, not painted, deposited in a way that looks suspiciously like electroplating. If that's what these jars were for, then someone in the ancient Near East understood how to coax invisible forces out of metal and liquid. Not in equations on a chalkboard, but in the hiss and shimmer of early experiments. Electricity, not as a theory, but as a craft. The anomalies are not only technological, they're biological as well. In burial sites from Peru to the Black Sea, archaeologists have uncovered elongated skulls. Some are clearly the result of deliberate cranial deformation. Infants' heads, bound with cloth or boards to create a high, tapering shape. A cultural practice, a symbol of status, of beauty, of identity. But a few skulls don't quite match the pattern. The sutures between bones are different. The volume is larger than average. The shape is not merely stretched, but fundamentally altered. Most experts argue that all of these can be explained by known cultural methods, by variation within normal human anatomy. Others suggest that at least some might represent a distinct population, a now vanished group with slightly different cranial structures. In folklore, such beings become sky people, priest kings, the long-headed ones who taught early humans arts and sciences. Then there are the stories of giants. Newspaper reports from the 19th and early 20th centuries describe enormous skeletons unearthed in North America, Europe and Asia. 8 feet tall, 10 feet tall, sometimes more. Often these accounts are vague, poorly documented or second-hand. Many are almost certainly exaggerations, mismeasurements or outright hoaxes. Yet the pattern persists. Bones that seem too large, femurs the length of a modern man's torso, skulls the size of helmets. Today, most of these skeletons are lost, miscatalogued, or simply never verified. Mainstream science dismisses them, sometimes with good reason. But the legends of a time when giants walked the earth run deep, from the Nephilim of the Hebrew Bible to the Titans of Greek myth, to Native American tales of enormous red-haired adversaries. Are these purely symbolic, or faint, distorted echoes of an earlier, more varied human landscape, a time when our family tree had more branches than we remember, Whenever evidence pushes at the borders of accepted timelines, something interesting happens, a pattern of resistance. A scholar publishes an unconventional find, and their reputation takes a hit. Funding dries up. Colleagues become cautious. The safest path in academia is to work within the known framework, not to question the frame itself. There have been cases where artifacts that challenge the timeline were quietly reclassified, moved to basements, or explained away with minimal examination. Not necessarily because of a grand conspiracy, but because humans are uncomfortable with uncertainty. Entire careers, entire theoretical models rest on the way we date a single layer of sediment or interpret a single shard of pottery. If an object appears that might rewrite the story, it's easier to say there must be a mistake than to start over. And yet, some of the strongest hints of lost knowledge come from the text that did survive. Ancient Indian scriptures describe flying machines, the vimanas, with technical terms for propulsion, materials and flight maneuvers. Greek myths speak of automata, self-moving statues crafted by Hephaestus, Talos the bronze guardian who circled Crete 3 times a day. The Bible mentions mysterious devices like the Ark of the Covenant, wrapped in precise measurements, lined with gold, charged with lethal glory. In Egypt, temple walls show precise star alignments and mathematical proportions. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets record lists of kings whose reigns stretch back tens of thousands of years, long before our accepted dates for organized civilization. In Mesoamerica, myths tell of previous suns, previous worlds destroyed by flood, fire and darkness, with survivors carrying fragments of knowledge into the next age. Most historians interpret these stories as metaphor, as mythic language for natural events, political power, and spiritual truths. But it's also possible that myth functions like genetic code for culture, compressed, encrypted, passed down through thousands of years, a memory of something real, transformed by time into symbol and legend. Put all of this together, the impossible gearworks rusting on a Mediterranean seafloor, the maps that know too much, the jars that spark with hidden current, the strange skulls, the stories of giants, the guarded archives of academia, the ancient texts that read like technical manuals for gods, and a different image begins to emerge. Not a clear photograph, more like a shadow behind a curtain, a suggestion that our species has not always climbed in a straight line, that there may have been rises and falls, advances and erasures, civilizations that pushed farther than we think, then vanished beneath ice, flood, or fire, leaving behind only a few stubborn relics. We can't say for certain what those relics prove. But they prepare us for a deeper question. If knowledge has been found and lost before, if we are not the first to reach for the stars or to bend nature to our will, then what happened to those who came before? And how much of their wisdom, fractured and scattered, still survives in our myths, our ruins and our bones? To answer that, we have to follow the survivors, the ones who carried embers of memory through the darkness from one world to the next. The older the story, the stranger the visitors who walk into it. Again and again, in cultures that supposedly never met, we find the same kind of figure stepping out of the ruins of disaster. A pale, bearded man in the Andes, a feathered serpent in Mesoamerica, a fish man rising from the sea in Mesopotamia, a ibis-headed scribe god on the Nile. Different names, different costumes, same role. They arrive after a cataclysm. They find traumatized people living in scattered bands, struggling just to eat, and they teach how to plant, how to measure the seasons, how to build in stone, how to write, how to live together under laws instead of chaos. Myths call them gods, or demigods, or sages. Modern scholars call them culture heroes, Some fringe researchers call them survivors from earlier civilizations. Whatever they were, ancient people agreed on one thing. These weren't ordinary wanderers. They were civilization bringers. Take Thoth in Egypt. In temple inscriptions, he isn't just a god. He's the inventor of writing, the keeper of time, the measurer of the heavens. Later traditions say he preserved the knowledge of a world before the flood, storing it in sacred texts and hidden chambers to be rediscovered when the stars were right again. He's described less like a deity of thunder and war, more like a cosmic librarian, quietly making sure nothing truly important is ever completely lost. On the other side of the world, in the high Andes, we meet Viracocha. Legends say he emerged after a time of darkness and floods, when the world had been destroyed and remade. He walked among shattered peoples, teaching them agriculture, architecture, and social order. Then he left, disappearing across the ocean, promising to return. Sound familiar? Further north in the Americas, the Aztecs and Maya remembered Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, half bird, half snake, a symbol of sky and earth bound together. In some stories he is a king priest from a Golden Age city, toppled by disaster and betrayal. He wanders, bringing astronomy, calendar systems, and moral codes to new peoples, before departing with a vow that his age will come again. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the oldest civilizations we know, the Babylonians told of Oannes. By day he came out of the Persian Gulf, a being with the body of a fish and the head and feet of a man. He refused food, spending his daylight hours teaching humans how to write, how to build cities, how to create laws and temples and crafts. At night he returned to the sea, like someone going home to a world beneath the waves. Different continents, different languages, but the same pattern. Some catastrophe, then a teacher from somewhere else, carrying knowledge that seems to arrive all at once instead of slowly evolving. Maybe these are just poetic ways of describing the moment when scattered groups begin to share ideas. Maybe gods from the sea are seafaring merchants, or refugees from drowned coasts. Or maybe, as some researchers quietly suggest, these stories are dim memories of the last survivors of earlier cycles, people who carried fragments of lost sciences and old maps in their heads and did the only thing they could, teach a simpler world what they remembered. If you were one of those survivors, knowledge would be your most fragile possession. Cities can fall. Monuments can sink into mud. But what you know, what you can show and tell and demonstrate, can leap across the gap between ages. That's where priesthoods and mystery schools come in. Everywhere we look in the ancient world, the deepest knowledge is guarded, structured, and passed on through carefully chosen people. Egyptian priest astronomers tracking Sirius and the solstices, Babylonian temple scholars recording eclipses for generations, Greek mystery cults whispering secret teachings in underground chambers, druids in the forests of Europe memorizing line after line of lore, never writing it down. Officially, these groups preserve religious ritual, but mixed in with the prayers and hymns we glimpse something else. Star catalogues, medical recipes, geometry, measurements of the earth. Things that feel oddly advanced for their time, as if they come from an older, quieter lineage. Mystery schools almost always tell the same story about themselves. They don't claim to invent their wisdom. They claim to inherit it. We received this from the ancients. This came from before the flood. This is the doctrine of the first time. As if they see themselves less as creators, more as custodians, guarding a flame that must not go out between cycles. But how do you hide a message for thousands of years, maybe through multiple disasters, without it being erased or distorted? You don't just write it on paper, you carve it into the world. Across the planet, sacred architecture seems to double as coded information. The Great Pyramid at Giza not only points almost perfectly to the cardinal directions, but its dimensions appear to encode ratios related to the Earth's circumference and the length of the year. Megalithic sites in Britain and Brittany align with solstices and lunar standstills, as if built to freeze celestial patterns in stone. Hindu temples are laid out as three-dimensional mandalas, embedding cosmology and psychology into their very floor plans. Even myths behave like time capsules. On the surface, they're just stories to entertain children around the fire. Underneath, they're dense with numbers, star names, and repeated motifs that look suspiciously like mnemonic devices. Serpents that wind like rivers or like the Milky Way. Boats that sail across the sky. Trees whose roots and branches connect 9 worlds. They may be doing what our bottleneck ancestors did, hiding practical, observational knowledge inside narratives so memorable that they can survive generations of chaos. Then there are the libraries. If temples and myths are slow-motion archives, institutions like the Library of Alexandria were attempts to gather everything in one place. Scrolls from Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, India, texts on medicine, engineering, geography, alchemy, and more. The ancients themselves said some of these works drew on far older sources, Egyptian temple records that claim to preserve knowledge from previous ages. We'll never know exactly what was on those shelves. Fires, wars, religious purges. Over centuries, the greatest library of the ancient world was erased almost completely. What little trickled through to us, fragments quoted in later authors, summaries of lost books, hints at things we can only guess about now, strange machines, vast historical chronologies stretching back tens of thousands of years, maps that may have recorded coastlines before the last ice sheets melted. Some people think the real treasures were never kept on papyrus at all. They imagine time capsules left by earlier civilizations in places unlikely to burn. Chambers under pyramids, vaults beneath the Sphinx, caverns sealed behind megaliths, drowned cities on continental shelves now hundreds of feet underwater. Maybe they're filled with nothing but air and stone dust. Or maybe, just maybe, they contain records encoded in materials and languages we no longer recognize. Even without secret vaults, there is another kind of time capsule. Us. When a modern engineer looks at a Roman aqueduct and instantly understands the principles, when a geneticist discovers a mechanism that older healing systems describe symbolically, when a physicist derives equations that echo ancient cosmological myths, something interesting is happening. The knowledge feels new, but the patterns are strangely familiar. As though we're not so much inventing reality from scratch, as slowly retranslating an older manual written in a language we lost. From this angle, history becomes less a straight line of progress and more a spiral. Each turn of the cycle, humans climb back toward levels of understanding reached before, sometimes overshooting, sometimes falling short, never perfectly repeating, but always rhyming. If that's true, then we, our textbooks, our technologies, our late-night questions, might simply be the latest attempt of the universe to remember itself after another forgetting. The myths of Thoth, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, and Oannes would be not just charming stories, but blurred portraits of real people who did what we might one day have to do, walk through a world of ruins and start teaching again. And if knowledge can survive floods, fires, and falling skies, passed from hand to hand, carved into stone, hidden in stories, then the line between lost and remembered might be thinner than it seems. Which brings us to us, the seventh civilization, standing at the edge of our own unknowns, wondering what, exactly, we've inherited from worlds that fell before. If the earlier civilizations in our story rose and fell across tens of thousands of years, our own story looks strangely fast, compressed, almost abrupt. Think about the timeline we actually know. For most of the last 300,000 years, humans lived in small bands, hunting, gathering, maybe tending a few early crops here and there. Then, about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something shifted. Agriculture, permanent settlements, villages becoming towns, towns becoming cities. Writing appears a few thousand years after that. Empires rise and fall. Bronze becomes iron, iron becomes steel. Sail becomes steam, steam becomes electricity. And then the real shock. In the last 200 years, less than a blink on the scale of our species, we go from horse-drawn carts to jet planes, from clay tablets to smartphones, from firelit caves to orbiting space stations. Your great-grandparents were born into a world without the internet, without antibiotics, without nuclear weapons or global satellite networks. In just a handful of generations, we've transformed the surface of the planet more dramatically than any known civilization before us. If we are the seventh civilization in the cycle, we are by far the fastest. But speed doesn't equal stability. In fact, it often means the opposite. Earlier in our story, survival depended on fire, stones and stories, tools you could carry, skills you could demonstrate, knowledge you could repeat out loud around the embers of a shared fire. If a drought came or a volcano erupted, you could move. Your culture was portable. Our civilization is different. It's not just built on tools and stories. It's built on electricity, on invisible networks of data, on global supply chains that move food, medicine and fuel across oceans every single day. Take away electricity for a week and life gets uncomfortable. Take it away for a year and our entire way of life begins to dissolve. We think of ourselves as advanced, and in many ways we are. But we've traded resilience for complexity. Imagine a major catastrophe hitting our world. Not even the dramatic end-of-all-things event, just something large enough to knock the system off balance. A massive solar storm frying satellites and power grids. A chain of volcanic eruptions throwing dust into the atmosphere. An engineered disease that spreads faster than we can contain it. Or something quieter and slower. Climate shifts that destabilize coastlines, agriculture, and the web of trade that feeds billions. How much of our technology could we actually rebuild from scratch if everything failed at once? Most of us don't know how to grow food without machines, how to purify water without chemicals and pumps, how to forge metal from raw ore, how to repair a generator, how to recreate even a basic radio. Critical knowledge is concentrated in tiny groups of specialists, just like it once was in the priestly astronomers of ancient temples or the guilds of forgotten stonecutters. If the cycle is real, this might be the repeating pattern. Civilizations climb high on towers of specialized knowledge, and then something shakes the ground beneath the tower. Most of the height comes crashing down. Only a few stones remain. So what stones would we leave behind? Fast forward 10,000 years. Long after our cities have been abandoned, what's still there? Most of what we think of as solid is surprisingly fragile. Asphalt roads crack and are swallowed by plants in a few decades. Wooden houses vanish in centuries. Steel beams corrode to dust in 1,000 years. Skyscrapers, bridges, cars, planes, all the iconic images of our age, don't actually last very long without constant maintenance. But some things endure. Our biggest dams are carved into bedrock. Our underground subway tunnels lace beneath cities in reinforced concrete. Our open-pit mines are scars in the crust, visible from space. Nuclear waste repositories, if they survive, will still be dangerous, still quietly humming with radiation after tens of thousands of years. Tiny glass fibers from our technology, microplastics buried in sediments, unexpected patterns of heavy metals in the soil, these could all whisper our story to whatever minds can read them. And then there's stone. We still build in stone and concrete. Monumental statues, mountain carvings, underground vaults. Some of these might last as long as the megaliths we ourselves struggle to date. If another species, or another future version of us, were to study Earth 100,000 years from now, perhaps they'd find the worn-down stumps of our cities the way we find weathered platforms beneath jungle canopy, geometric shapes that clearly aren't natural, but whose builders are long gone. Maybe they'd argue over whether the traces came from one civilization or many. Maybe they'd debate whether the anomalies in the sediment record, the spike in carbon, the sudden appearance of plastics, the extinction patterns, were evidence of an advanced culture or just an unusually active geological period, the same way we argue today about ancient floods and sunken plateaus. If the cycle continues, we may be just another layer in the fossil record of forgotten experiments. The uncomfortable question is, are we approaching another reset point? Some patterns are hard to ignore: rapid climate change, mass extinction, resource depletion, growing dependence on technologies that most people don't understand and can't repair. In earlier ages, a civilization might have been wiped out by a comet or a supervolcano. Ours could be threatened by our own cleverness, by our ability to reshape the planet faster than we can fully predict the consequences. But the story doesn't have to be all doom. Remember those tiny bands of bottleneck survivors, huddled around their fires on the edge of extinction. They didn't just endure, they adapted. They used crisis as a filter, a refinement, a forge. If there were 6 civilizations before us, each one that rose and fell still managed to pass something forward. Stories, symbols, myths, fragments of technology encoded in legend. Maybe the fire from the gods remembered in ancient tales is just the memory of someone somewhere, rediscovering a lost technique from a prior age. If that's true, then our responsibility as the 7th civilization is twofold. First, we have to try, not to avoid all catastrophe, because that may be impossible, but to soften the crash, to build systems that can fail gracefully instead of shattering completely, redundancies, local skills, communities that remember how to do things with their hands as well as their devices, knowledge stored not just in the cloud, but in books, in stone, in durable media that doesn't depend on servers and subscriptions. Second, we have to preserve what really matters, understanding. It's easy to imagine future archaeologists finding the shattered remains of our laptops and wondering what they did. The hardware will be there long after the software is gone. The shapes will remain when the meanings have evaporated. To keep meaning alive, you need continuity. Teachers, students, stories that explain not just what we knew, but how we knew it. We might carve basic scientific principles in long-lasting materials, maintain libraries designed to outlive political systems, create cultural traditions that celebrate curiosity and critical thinking, so that even if the gadgets fail, the habit of asking questions survives. In a sense, we would be doing for future civilizations what our bottleneck ancestors did for us, passing through the eye of the needle with as much knowledge intact as possible. And then there's the deepest question of all. Should we try to break the cycle? Maybe the rise and fall of civilizations is not a flaw, but a feature. A way for intelligence to keep reinventing itself, shedding old structures when they become too rigid, too brittle, too self-destructive. Each reset clearing the board for a new kind of imagination. Or maybe, with enough self-awareness, a civilization can step out of that pattern. Learn from the scars of its predecessors, real or imagined. Use its knowledge not just to grow taller, but to grow wiser, to expand its power without collapsing under the weight of its own complexity. We don't know which is true. We may never know. But as you lie there, drifting towards sleep, you are part of the 7th civilization. You carry in your mind the same evolutionary tools that pulled your ancestors through ice ages and disasters: curiosity, cooperation, memory. Those are the real technologies, the ones that last. Whatever comes next, another reset, a long plateau, or a breakthrough into something completely new, those quiet, ancient abilities will be there, glowing inside you like a small, steady fire in the dark. The strange thing isn't that stories of lost worlds exist. The strange thing is how little we remember and how quickly we forget. For a species that evolved to obsess over teaching children every scrap of survival wisdom, we are shockingly bad at holding on to our own past. Psychologists have a name for this: cultural amnesia. The way entire societies can lose memories the way an individual might forget a dream a few minutes after waking up. It feels vivid, important, unforgettable, and then it's gone, replaced by whatever the present moment demands. We like to imagine that once something is written down, carved in stone, recorded in archives, it's safe forever. But history says otherwise. Take the Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE. Before it happened, the Eastern Mediterranean was a web of advanced civilizations. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the mysterious people of Ugarit and Byblos and countless other cities. They traded copper and tin across continents to make bronze. They wrote in multiple scripts. They sent diplomatic letters, sealed with royal symbols across hundreds of miles. They built palaces, organized armies, kept bureaucratic records of harvests and taxes and treaties. They were not primitive. They were not isolated. They were connected, complex, and remarkably sophisticated. Then, in the span of a few generations, the web snapped. Cities burned, trade routes broke, populations shrank, writing systems vanished. In some regions, literacy disappeared for centuries. People still lived there, still farmed and fished and raised children, but the memory of the system that had supported their grandparents simply dissolved. For later Greeks, the Bronze Age was dim legend, Trojan wars wrapped in myth, gods arguing over heroes whose real lives had been swallowed by time. Those palaces, those archives, those carefully maintained records, buried under their own rubble, forgotten so thoroughly that when archaeologists rediscovered them in the 19th and 20th centuries, the scripts they found were completely unknown. Entire writing systems had to be painstakingly decoded from scratch. That's what a collapse can do. It doesn't just knock down buildings. It scrambles the story people tell about themselves, and that's in a world only a few thousand years removed from our own. Now stretch that out. 10,000 years, 50,000, 100,000. Civilizations rising, thriving, falling in places that are now under forests, deserts, coastlines that long ago drowned beneath rising seas. If a network of literate palace-building societies can melt into legend in 3,000 years, what happens across 300,000? Or 3 million? We tend to imagine memory as a ladder we can climb all the way down, rung by rung back to the beginning. But the truth is more like a series of broken bridges. We see one stretch clearly, then there's a gap, a dark ravine where the path should be. On the other side, faint shapes, the outlines of something, but no direct connection. Catastrophe widens those gaps. Floods don't just wash away houses, they erase archives. Volcanic eruptions don't just bury towns, they seal libraries under meters of ash. Earthquakes topple temples and crush the clay tablets stored inside. A few might survive, kiln-fired by disaster into accidental time capsules. Most simply break, dissolve, disappear. Then there are slower catastrophes. Centuries of drought that push people to abandon cities. Forests reclaiming stone. Salt air eating carvings on coastal cliffs. Generations who no longer remember which ruins were sacred, which were dangerous, which were simply forgotten. Because memory isn't just what's written, it's what's spoken. And oral traditions, for all their power, are fragile across deep time. Your ancestors in the bottleneck understood this. They repeated crucial knowledge until children could recite it in their sleep. They wrapped dangerous truths in stories, in taboos and myths, so they wouldn't be ignored. But even the best storytellers are human. Over a few generations, details shift. Over a few hundred, characters merge, places move, meanings invert. Over a few thousand, the original event might still be there, buried inside, but covered in layers of metaphor and misunderstanding. A real flood becomes a world flood. A regional war becomes a war of gods. A continent-wide drought becomes an age when the sun was angry and the sky forgot how to rain. If there were civilizations before ours, and if any memory of them survived, it likely travelled through time as myth, whispered by firesides, sung in rituals, told as warnings to children who'd never seen a city but somehow carried stories of towers and great stoneworks and people before our people who angered the heavens. And over longer stretches, another force acts on memory, not disaster, not erosion, choice. Sometimes knowledge isn't just lost, it's buried on purpose. Empires have always understood that controlling history means controlling the present. Every conquering power rewrites the story to put themselves at the centre, as the climax, as the rightful inheritors of everything that came before. Priesthoods decide which texts are sacred and which are heresy. Libraries are burned as acts of purification. Old gods are renamed, demonized, or simply labelled pagan and pushed into the shadows. Calendars are reset. Year 1 is declared again and again, as if nothing worth counting happened before. If there were records somewhere hinting that humans were older, stranger, more cyclical than we like to admit, how many chances have there been for those records to be destroyed, altered, or locked behind walls we no longer even know exist? Even now, archives lie in basements, caves, monastery vaults, private collections, untranslated tablets, unpublished manuscripts, inscribed stones catalogued and then forgotten in museum storerooms. Not exactly conspiracies, but layers of obscurity. Knowledge that technically exists but might as well be invisible. And behind all of this is something even quieter, a psychological barrier. We are uncomfortable with the idea that we are not the first, that our skyscrapers and satellites and algorithms might be just one more expression of an older pattern, that other civilizations different from ours but no less real might have already walked their own arc of rise and fall, invention and amnesia. We like clean narratives, a straight line from cave paintings to smartphones, a single ascent guided by progress and reason with us at the top. A longer human story is messy. It implies not just growth, but cycles, not just advancement, but forgetting. It asks us to consider that we might not be exceptional, just next. So we resist. We label anything that doesn't fit the accepted timeline as anomaly, misinterpretation, or fringe speculation. Sometimes that skepticism is healthy. It protects us from wishful thinking, from building castles out of coincidences, but sometimes it becomes another kind of amnesia, not forgetting by accident, but refusing to remember, declining to look too closely at evidence that suggests our past might be deeper, stranger, and more repetitive than we are comfortable with, and so we find ourselves here, on a planet whose crust keeps recycling itself, whose seas rise and fall, whose climates swing from ice age to greenhouse and back again, on continents where we keep unearthing puzzles, tools older than our stories say they should be, myths that line up too neatly with geological events, structures whose purpose we still argue about, surrounded by hints that the story of humanity is not a single chapter, but a long tattered book with missing pages, erased lines, and marginal notes in languages we no longer read. We know we are the seventh civilization only in the sense that we are seventh in our own chosen mythology. The seventh in a cycle some claim stretches back through Lemuria, Atlantis, Hyperborea, Mu, Antediluvian empires, forgotten builders. Is that cycle real history, or a dream humanity keeps dreaming about itself? The deeper mystery isn't whether those worlds existed exactly as the legends describe. The deeper mystery is why, if anything like them ever walked the earth, the memory of them has become so faint that we can only glimpse them in the corner of our eye, through myth, symbol, and stone that doesn't quite fit. What have we forgotten? What lies in the gaps between collapses and recoveries, between the burning of libraries and the telling of bedtime stories, between what we can prove and what we can only feel as an echo? As you drift towards sleep, you're lying at the very tip of a long, fragile chain of memory that stretches back through ice ages, bottlenecks, lost cities, and unnamed ancestors who refuse to let the story end. Somewhere along that chain, whole chapters have gone missing. Maybe, in dreams, we visit them still. For a while now, you've been travelling in two directions at once. Backward, into imagined ages before memory, and inward, into that quiet place where stories start to blur into dreams. You've walked through 6 lost civilizations tonight. Lemuria dissolving into the mist of the Pacific. Atlantis rising and falling in sudden flashes like lightning over a dark horizon. Hyperborea glowing faintly beyond the north wind. Mu, the whispering motherland. The antediluvian world, breathing just beneath the waters of a remembered flood. And the builders, leaving stone puzzles scattered across the planet like messages we were meant to find much, much later. Each one appeared for a moment in your mind, then slipped back into the shadows. Each one carried the same haunting pattern, a rise, a flowering, a moment of brilliance, and then, somehow, an ending. Sometimes the destroyer looked like water, sometimes like fire, or ice, or falling stone from the sky. Sometimes it looked like time itself, slowly erasing everything that wasn't carved into bedrock. You've also met the survivors, the wanderers who might have watched their own worlds vanish and still carried something forward, a story, a measurement, a symbol scratched onto stone, a half-remembered map of the sky. Maybe they were the ones who lit the first ceremonial fires. Maybe they murmured warnings about cycles and returns and ages that turn like wheels. And now, here you are, a member of the 7th civilization, lying in the dark, listening to echoes of lives that may or may not have existed in the way we imagine them. The only certainty is that something came before us, and something will come after, and we are a brief, bright bridge between the two. There's a strange kind of comfort in that. Cycles can be terrifying if you focus only on the destruction. But look at them another way, and they're also promises. After every ending, something new learns how to begin. After every collapse, a few stubborn sparks refuse to go out. Maybe that's what we are. The latest flicker in a very long chain of lights, each one thinking it's the first or the last, while the universe just keeps gently turning. As you drift towards sleep, you don't have to decide what was real and what was myth. You can let both possibilities sit side by side like stones in an ancient wall. Maybe Lemuria and Atlantis and Hyperborea were once real places, worn down by tides and tectonic shifts. Maybe they're memory palaces, built by our ancestors to explain disasters they couldn't fully understand. Maybe there's something in between. The truth might be stranger and quieter than any story we tell about it. What matters is the curiosity that survives, the questions that keep reaching backward, the part of you that wants to scrape gently at the surface of time and ask, what was here before us? Who watched the same stars and worried about the same storms? Hold on to that question, but loosely, like a feather between your fingers. Let it guide you to new books, new ideas, new ruins, new maps. Let it wander even as your body grows heavy and your thoughts slow down. If you'd like to keep exploring these lost worlds together, you can gently tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey through deep time. If you feel awake enough, you're warmly invited to leave a comment and share where in the world you're listening from. It's a small way of reminding ourselves that this seventh civilization is wide and varied and very much alive. For now, though, you don't have to be an explorer or a survivor or a keeper of ancient secrets. You can just be a quiet witness, floating on the surface of a planet that has seen more stories than we'll ever know. Let the lost civilizations sink softly below the horizon of your thoughts. Let the cycles turn without fear. You're part of the pattern now, part of the long memory of the Earth. Rest and drift and dream of worlds that came before, and worlds still waiting, somewhere ahead in the dark and patient ocean of time.